The scissors made a sickening sound as they sliced through Margaret's golden hair, each strand falling like autumn leaves onto the dusty wooden floor of the auction house. Her 7-year-old daughter Claire pressed against the wall, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks as strange men in expensive suits circled her mother like vultures. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the crowded room. "Beautiful specimen, gentlemen. Look at those hands, perfect for household work. And that face." But then a deep voice cut through the chaos from the back of the room. "I'll take them both." The crowd turned to see a tall figure in a weathered cowboy hat stepping forward, his boots clicking against the floorboards with purpose. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The morning had started like any other in the cramped tenement building on Bleecker Street. Margaret Henderson woke before dawn, her calloused hands already reaching for the bundle of piecework she'd brought home from the textile factory. Claire stirred beside her on the thin mattress they shared, her small body curled against the November cold that seeped through the cracked walls of their single room. "Mama?" Claire's voice was barely a whisper in the pre-dawn darkness. "Shoo, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. Mama's just working a little before the factory bell rings." Margaret lit their single candle and bent over the fabric, her needle moving in practiced rhythm despite the dim light. Every stitch meant a penny. Every penny brought them closer to having enough for next month's rent. The mathematics of survival had become second nature. 12 cents for a loaf of bread, 15 for a pound of potatoes, $32 for the rent that Mr. Kowalski demanded every month without fail. The Henderson women had been barely scraping by since Margaret's husband Thomas died in the factory accident 2 years prior. The Riverside Cotton Mill had offered her $27 in compensation for his life, paid out over 6 months with the stern warning that any legal action would result in immediate termination of her own employment. Margaret had taken the money and swallowed her pride, knowing that pride wouldn't feed Claire or keep a roof over their heads. Claire was different from the other children in their building. While most kids her age spent their days running wild through the streets or working in the mills alongside their parents, Claire possessed an unusual intelligence that manifested in her ability to read at a level far beyond her years. Margaret had taught her using discarded newspapers and any book she could find, determined that her daughter would have opportunities she herself never had. "Mrs. Henderson?" The voice at their door made Margaret's blood run cold. She recognized the nasal tone of Eddie Kowalski, their landlord's son, who served as the family's primary rent collector and enforcer. Margaret blew out the candle and moved to the door, her heart pounding. It was still 3 days before rent was due. Eddie's early visits never brought good news. "Yes, open up. Got some business to discuss." Margaret's hands trembled as she unlatched the door. Eddie stood in the hallway with 2 other men she didn't recognize, one tall and thin with a pencil mustache, the other short and stocky with cruel eyes that immediately made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Henderson, these gentlemen are here about your situation." "What situation? I've never missed rent. The month isn't even up yet." Eddie stepped inside without invitation, forcing Margaret back into the small space. Claire sat up on the mattress, clutching their thin blanket to her chest. "See, that's where you're wrong," Eddie continued, pulling a crumpled paper from his jacket. "Says here you owe the mill $15 for damaged equipment. Something about a machine malfunction last week that they're holding you responsible for." Margaret's mouth went dry. She remembered the incident. A shuttle had broken while she was operating it, but she'd reported it immediately to the floor supervisor. Manufacturing defects were common, and workers were never held liable for equipment failures beyond their control. "That's not possible. I reported that malfunction. Mr. Davidson said it wasn't my fault." The tall man with the mustache spoke for the first time, his voice smooth and educated in a way that made Margaret instantly wary. Mr. Davidson is no longer with the mill. New management has reviewed all recent incidents and determined that negligent operation was the cause. The $15 plus accumulated interest and processing fees brings your total debt to $28. I don't have $28. I barely make $28 a month. Which brings us to the solution, Eddie said, his smile revealing yellowed teeth. These gentlemen represent certain business interests that specialize in helping folks work off their debts. The shorter man stepped forward, his eyes scanning Margaret from head to toe like she was livestock at market. Pretty woman like you shouldn't be any trouble finding suitable employment to cover what's owed. Margaret instinctively stepped back, pulling Claire behind her. She'd heard whispers about women who'd gotten into debt and disappeared, about the kinds of employment that certain businessmen offered to desperate families. What kind of employment? Domestic service, the tall man replied smoothly. Wealthy households always need reliable help. The work pays well, includes room and board. Very generous arrangement. And if I refuse? Eddie's expression hardened. Then you'll be evicted immediately, and the debt will be turned over to the authorities. Debtor's prison ain't no place for a woman with a child. Margaret knew about the prison. She'd seen women emerge from there broken and hollow-eyed, their children scattered to orphanages or worse. The system was designed to trap people like her, working folks who lived one disaster away from complete ruin. I need time to think. No time, the short man said bluntly. Decision's gotta be made now. Either you come willing, or we take you. Anyway, under legal authority. What about Claire? The two strangers exchanged a look. Child stays here. She'd be looked after. Margaret's heart stopped. She knew what looked after meant in their world. Claire would end up in one of the overcrowded orphanages where children died regularly from disease and malnutrition. Or worse, sold to factories where 7-year-olds worked 14-hour days in conditions that broke grown men. No, if I go. She goes with me. That's not how this works, Eddie said. The debt is for one person's labor, not 2 mouths to feed. Claire pressed closer to her mother, her small hands clutching Margaret's worn skirt. The little girl didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could feel the danger in the room as clearly as if it were a living thing. Please, Margaret whispered, she's all I have left. The tall man consulted a pocket watch. We have other appointments today. Mrs. Henderson, you have exactly 60 seconds to make your decision. Come with us now, voluntarily, and we'll ensure the child is placed with a respectable family. Refuse, and we'll have the authorities remove you both, and the child becomes a ward of the state. Margaret looked around their tiny room, at the needle and thread scattered across the table, at Claire's few precious belongings arranged carefully on a wooden crate that served as their dresser, at the small window that looked out onto the narrow alley where laundry hung between the buildings like surrender flags. This had been their home, meager as it was. Here, they had been together. Time's up, the short man announced. Before Margaret could respond, Eddie grabbed Claire's arm and pulled her away from her mother. The little girl cried out in fear, reaching desperately for Margaret. Don't hurt her. Margaret lunged forward, but the tall man caught her wrist in an iron grip. Then you'll cooperate. Margaret's world collapsed into a single moment of impossible choice. Save herself and abandon Claire, or resist and lose them both to a system that would show no mercy to either of them. I'll come, she whispered. The next few hours passed in a nightmarish blur. They allowed Margaret 5 minutes to gather her few possessions, while Eddie held Claire in the hallway. The little girl sobbed quietly, her face pressed against the wall, as her mother was forced to pack the remnants of their life into a single carpet bag. I'll come back for you, Margaret whispered to Claire as they prepared to leave. I promise. Sweetheart, Mama will come back. But even as she said the words, Margaret knew how hollow they sounded. Women who disappeared into debt slavery rarely returned. The system was designed to keep them trapped, moving them from one obligation to another until they were used up completely. The carriage ride through the city took them past neighborhoods Margaret had only glimpsed before, tree-lined streets, where mansions sat behind iron gates, where well-dressed families strolled along manicured sidewalks without a care in the world. The contrast with her own life felt like a physical blow. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Auction house on Fifth Avenue," the tall man replied without looking up from his newspaper. "High-end clientele. You should fetch a good price." The word price hit Margaret like a slap. Whatever illusions she'd maintained about domestic employment evaporated. She was being sold, plain and simple. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The auction house was a converted warehouse that had been decorated to look respectable from the outside. Inside, however, it was exactly what Margaret had feared. Rows of wooden benches filled with well-dressed men examining women like merchandise. Some of the women stood on a raised platform at the front of the room, while others sat in chairs along the walls, their eyes vacant with resignation. A woman with steel-gray hair and cold eyes approached them. "Margaret Henderson? I'm Mrs. Blackwood. I run this establishment. You'll be cleaned up and prepared for the presentation." Margaret was led to a back room where her worn clothes were taken away and replaced with a simple white dress that was both modest and revealing enough to display her figure. Her golden hair, which she'd always worn long as a small source of pride, was brushed until it shone. "Beautiful color," Mrs. Blackwood noted, running her fingers through Margaret's locks. "Natural blonde always brings premium buyers." Then came the moment that would haunt Margaret forever. Mrs. Blackwood produced a pair of sharp scissors and, without warning, began cutting away Margaret's hair in long sections. Each cut felt like a piece of her identity being stripped away. "Why?" Margaret asked, tears streaming down her face. "Buyers like to know they're getting something fresh," Mrs. Blackwood replied matter-of-factly. "Hair grows back. Your spirit, on the other hand, needs to be broken from the start." The shorn hair was gathered into bundles and placed in boxes. "These will be sold separately," Mrs. Blackwood explained. "Natural blonde hair fetches good money for wig makers." When Margaret finally stepped onto the auction platform, she barely recognized herself. Her reflection in the window showed a broken woman with cropped hair and hollow eyes, wearing a dress that marked her as property rather than a person. The bidding started at $50. Margaret tried to disappear into herself as strange men called out numbers, evaluating her like livestock. She thought of Claire, alone and frightened, and wondered if her daughter would even remember her face when she was older. $100, called a voice from the middle of the room. $125, responded another. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine she was somewhere else, back in their little room, reading to Claire by candlelight, both of them safe and together. $150, the bids climbed higher. Margaret opened her eyes and saw the faces in the crowd, some hungry with obvious intent, others coldly calculating, all of them viewing her as an object to be acquired and used. $200. The voice belonged to a thin man in expensive suit who sat in the front row. Margaret had noticed him earlier because of the way his eyes had lingered on her with a particular kind of hunger that made her stomach turn. Mrs. Blackwood smiled. "Lord Ashford bids $200. Do I hear $225? The room fell silent. $200 was apparently a significant sum for this kind of transaction. Going once. Going twice. $500. The voice came from the back of the room, deep and authoritative. Margaret turned with everyone else to see a tall figure in a weathered cowboy hat and long duster coat standing near the entrance. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could see a strong jawline and calm, steady eyes that seemed out of place in this room of predators. A murmur ran through the crowd. $500 was clearly far beyond what anyone had expected. 500? Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. Sir, are you certain? The man stepped forward, his boots clicking against the wooden floor with measured precision. As he moved into the light, Margaret could see. He was probably in his 40s, with sun-weathered skin and hands that spoke of hard work rather than idle wealth. I'm certain, and I want the child too. The room erupted in surprised chatter. Mrs. Blackwood looked genuinely confused. Child? Sir, there is no child included in this lot. The stranger's eyes found Margaret's across the crowded room. Something passed between them, not romance or attraction, but a kind of recognition. He saw her not as property, but as a person. Margaret Henderson's daughter, 7 years old, Claire. His voice carried absolute authority. I want them both. That's not how this works. The child isn't part of the debt arrangement. The man reached into his coat and produced a thick roll of bills. Then I'll pay her debt separately. How much to clear everything? The woman. The child, all obligations? Mrs. Blackwood's eyes widened at the sight of so much cash. Margaret could see her mental calculations working. This was probably more money than the auction house saw in a typical month. The child isn't here, she said carefully. Then we'll go get her. All of us, together. The stranger's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Lord Ashford, who had been silent since being outbid, suddenly stood up. Now see here. I had the winning bid before this. This cowboy interrupted. The stranger turned to face Lord Ashford, and Margaret saw something in his posture that made several men in the room take an unconscious step backward. This was a man who had faced down dangerous situations before. Your bid was 200. Mine is 500, plus whatever it takes to get the child. Mrs. Blackwood, do we have a deal? The woman running the auction looked between the stranger and Lord Ashford, clearly calculating the safest course of action. Lord Ashford was undoubtedly connected to powerful people who could cause her trouble. But $500 in cash, plus more for the child, represented immediate profit that was hard to ignore. The total obligation, including interest and fees, would be $800 for both, she said finally. Without hesitation, the stranger began counting out bills. 800 it is. As the money changed hands, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a flicker of hope. She didn't know who this man was or what his intentions might be, but he had just done something no one else in that room would have considered. He'd chosen to keep a mother and daughter together, the carriage that awaited them outside the auction. House was unlike anything Margaret had ever seen. The black lacquered wood gleamed despite the overcast afternoon, and the leather seats inside were soft as butter. But what struck her most was the silence. No creaking wheels, no rattling harnesses. Even the horses seemed to move with unusual grace. The man who had purchased her, freedom, she still couldn't think of it any other way, sat across from her with his hat pulled low. He'd introduced himself simply as Jake Morrison and had said nothing more during the tense negotiations to retrieve Claire from Eddie Kowalski. Those negotiations had been their own kind of theater. Eddie had initially refused to release Claire, claiming she was now his responsibility and demanding additional payment for her care. Jake Morrison had listened to this with the patience of a man accustomed to dealing with snakes, then had quietly informed Eddie that he could accept $50 for the child's release. Or he could explain to the police why he was holding a 7-year-old against her will. Eddie had taken the $50 that now. Claire sat pressed against her mother's side, her small hand clutched in Margaret's. The little girl hadn't spoken since they'd left the tenement building, but her eyes darted constantly between her mother and the mysterious stranger who had somehow saved them both. "Where are we going?" Margaret finally asked as the carriage turned onto a street she didn't recognize. "My property. About an hour outside the city." Jake's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "You'll both be safe there. What do you expect in return?" Jake looked up from beneath his hat brim, and Margaret saw eyes that were tired but not cruel. Nothing you're not willing to give freely. The answer was both reassuring and unsettling. Margaret had learned not to trust generosity, especially from men. In her experience, kindness always came with a price that wasn't revealed until it was too late to negotiate. As they left the city behind, the landscape began to change. The cramped tenements and smoking factories gave way to rolling hills dotted with farmhouses and fields that stretched to the horizon. Claire pressed her face to the window, watching cattle graze in pastures that seemed impossibly green after the gray streets of their old neighborhood. "I've never seen so much space," Claire whispered, speaking for the first time since morning. Jake smiled at this, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Wait until you see the ranch. Plenty of room to run and explore." "We'll be working at your ranch?" Margaret asked. "If you want to. But not the kind of work you're thinking of." Jake shifted in his seat, and Margaret noticed he moved carefully, as if favoring an old injury. "I need help with the books, correspondence, that sort of thing. My foreman handles most of the day-to-day operations, but the business side." He shrugged. "Numbers and letters were never my strong suit." Margaret felt a spark of something she'd almost forgotten: professional interest. Before Thomas died, she'd helped him with the bookkeeping for his carpentry business. She'd always been good with figures, and the prospect of using her mind instead of just her hands was almost too good to believe. "Why us?" she asked. "You could hire a trained bookkeeper from the city." "Could, but trained bookkeepers don't usually come with 7-year-old daughters who need a place to grow up safe." The simple honesty of the statement caught Margaret off guard. She studied Jake's profile as he gazed out at the passing countryside, trying to read the man who had just upended her world with $800 and what seemed like genuine kindness. The ranch, when they finally arrived, was nothing like what Margaret had expected. She'd imagined a rough homestead, perhaps a log cabin and a few outbuildings. Instead, she found herself looking at what could only be called an estate, a sprawling 2-story house with wraparound porches, surrounded by well-maintained barns, stables, and worker housing. The whole operation spoke of serious money and careful management. "How much land do you have?" Margaret asked as they climbed down from the carriage. "About 12,000 acres. We run cattle, mostly some horses. Employ near 40 men year-round. Twice that during roundup season." The numbers were staggering. Margaret quickly calculated what an operation like this must be worth and realized that Jake Morrison had spent less than a day's profit to buy their freedom. The thought was both humbling and deeply puzzling. A Mexican woman in her 50s emerged from the house as they approached. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her simple dress was clean and well-fitted. Most importantly, her face showed none of the wariness Margaret had learned to expect from other women when a new female arrived in their territory. "Margaret, Claire, this is Elena Rodriguez. She runs the household and keeps me from starving to death." Jake's tone held genuine affection. "Elena, these are our new residents." Elena's eyes took in Margaret's shorn hair and cheap dress, then shifted to Claire's frightened face. Whatever she saw there seemed to settle something in her expression. "Benvenidas," she said warmly, then switched to accented but clear English. "Welcome. You must be tired from the journey." Claire stepped closer to her mother, overwhelmed by yet another new person in a day that had already contained too many changes. Elena noticed the child's shyness and crouched down to Claire's eye level. "Are you hungry, Pequega?" "I made fresh bread this morning, and there's honey from our own bees." The mention of honey made Claire's eyes widen. Honey had been an unimaginable luxury in their old life, something they saw in shop windows but never tasted. "Can I really have some?" Claire asked quietly. "All you want," Elena promised, then stood and addressed Margaret. "I'll show you to your room so you can get settled. Dinner is at 6, but if you need anything before then, just ask." Rooms, plural. Margaret tried to process this as Elena led them into the house. The interior was as impressive as the exterior, polished wood floors, comfortable furniture, and windows that let in streams of afternoon sunlight. Everything was well made, but not ostentatious, functional, but beautiful. "This is yours," Elena said, opening a door to reveal a bedroom that was larger than the entire space Margaret and Claire had shared in the city. A real bed with a thick mattress dominated the room, flanked by a dresser and a writing desk positioned near the window. "And this," she continued, opening a connecting door, "is for Claire." Claire's room was painted a soft yellow and furnished with a child-sized bed, a toy chest, and shelves lined with books, real books with leather bindings and gilt lettering. "I read those?" Claire asked in amazement. "They're yours now," Elena said simply. "Senator Morrison thought you might like them." Margaret felt tears threatening. The kindness was overwhelming, almost frightening in its completeness. She'd spent so long expecting the worst from every situation that genuine generosity left her feeling off balance and vulnerable. "I should warn you," Elena continued as Claire explored her new room. "The center has some unusual ideas about how to run a household. He believes everyone should eat together when possible, that children should have time to play, that adults should have work that uses their minds as well as their hands. It may take some getting used to." "What happened to the last bookkeeper?" Margaret asked. Elena's expression grew sad. "There was no bookkeeper before. Senner tried to manage the books himself, but—" She gestured helplessly. "He is a good man, but numbers are not his gift. The ranch has been successful despite his bookkeeping, not because of it." That evening, Margaret found herself sitting at a dining room table with Jake, Elena, and three of the ranch's senior hands: the foreman, a weathered man named Sam Carter; the horse trainer, a quiet younger man called Tommy Walsh; and the cook, a cheerful giant named Big Jim Peterson. Claire sat beside her mother, still overwhelmed but gradually warming to the friendly atmosphere. The meal was unlike anything Margaret had experienced in years. There was plenty of food: roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and bread that was still warm from the oven. But more than that, there was conversation. The men discussed the day's work, debated the best way to handle a difficult stallion, and shared stories that made Claire giggle despite her shyness. "Mrs. Henderson," Sam Carter said during a lull in the conversation, "Jake tells us you'll be taking over the books. I gotta say, we're all grateful. Trying to figure out what money was coming and going has been giving us all headaches." "I'll do my best," Margaret replied. "Though I should warn you, I've only handled small business accounts before. Nothing on this scale." "Scale's just more of the same," Big Jim said with a grin. "Money coming in, money going out. Long as it adds up right at the end, we're happy." After dinner, Jake walked Margaret and Claire out onto the front porch. The sun was setting over the rolling hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossibly vivid after years of gray city sunsets. "It's beautiful," Margaret said softly. "One of the reasons I settled here, and the land's good for cattle." Jake leaned against the porch rail, his posture relaxed for the calm first time since she'd met him. "I want you to know, there's no debt between us. What I paid today was my choice, freely made. You don't owe me anything." "Everyone owes someone something," Margaret replied automatically, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. It's hard to believe that kindness can exist without a price. I understand. But I need you to try to believe it, because Claire's watching how you react to this place. If you can't trust the safety here, neither will she." Margaret looked down at her daughter, who had wandered to the edge of the porch and was watching fireflies begin to blink in the gathering dusk. The child's face held a wonder that had been absent for too long. "Why did you buy us?" Margaret asked again. "The real reason." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I had a daughter once," he said finally, "about Claire's age. She died of fever 3 winters ago, along with my wife. The house has been too quiet ever since." The simple statement explained everything and nothing. Margaret wanted to ask more questions, but something in Jake's posture warned her that this particular door would only open so far. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said instead. "Life's hard for everyone. The difference is how much choice you have and how you face the hardness." Jake straightened up and tipped his hat. "I'll let you folks get settled. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I'll show you the office and we can start sorting through the mess I've made of the accounts." As Jake walked away, Margaret remained on the porch with Claire, watching the stars emerge in the vast sky above them. For the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to think about the future as something other than a series of obstacles to survive. "Mama?" Claire's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes, sweetheart? Are we going to stay here?" Margaret looked out over the peaceful ranch, then down at her daughter's upturned face. "I think we might, baby. I think we just might." That night, Margaret lay in a real bed with clean sheets, listening to the sounds of the countryside, owls calling, cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through grass. Claire slept in the next room, safe behind a door that could be locked from the inside, in a bed that belonged to her, but Margaret couldn't quite let herself relax. Years of hardship had taught her to be suspicious of good fortune, to look for the trap hidden inside every gift. Jake Morrison seemed genuine. His household appeared to run on principles of fairness and respect, and the work he offered was exactly what she'd dreamed of during those long nights of piecework by candlelight. Still, she'd learned that men, even good men, could change when they felt they owned something. $800 was a substantial investment, and investments were expected to pay returns. Margaret resolved to be grateful but cautious, to protect Claire while proving her worth as quickly as possible. The next morning brought her first real test. Jake led her to his office, a book-lined room that looked out over the ranch's main courtyard. The desk was covered with papers, invoices, receipts, contracts, and correspondence that had clearly been accumulating for months. "I warned you it was a mess," Jake said sheepishly. "I kept meaning to hire someone from town to sort it out, but the ranch kept me too busy." Margaret surveyed the chaos with the eye of someone who'd dealt with her husband's meticulous records, and then managed her own desperate finances for 2 years. Underneath the disorder, she could see the bones of a substantial operation. "How do you know if you're making money?" she asked. "The bank account keeps growing, so I figure we must be doing something right. But I couldn't tell you which parts of the operation are profitable and which aren't." Margaret nodded and rolled up her sleeves. "Well, let's find out." 3 weeks into her new life, Margaret discovered that Jake Morrison was hiding something far more dangerous than grief. She'd been working late in the office, sorting through a particularly confusing batch of cattle sale records, when she heard voices drifting through the open window. 2 men were talking near the horse corral, their words carrying clearly in the still night air. "Boss, we got a problem. Rodriguez found tracks near the south pasture. At least 6 riders, maybe more. They're getting bolder." Margaret recognized Sam Carter's voice, but the second speaker was unfamiliar, one of the newer hands, perhaps. "How close to the house?" Jake's response was calm, but Margaret caught an undertone that made her blood chill. "Quarter mile, maybe less. They circled the main herd twice before moving on. This ain't random rustling, boss. They're scouting us specifically." Margaret quietly moved closer to the window, her heart pounding. In the city, danger came from poverty and desperation. Out here, apparently, it took different forms. "Double the night watch," Jake instructed, "and send word to Sheriff Bradley in town. I want him to know what's happening, even if he can't do much about it." "You think it's the Dawson gang?" The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Even in the city, people had heard of the Dawson brothers, outlaws who specialized in targeting Prosperous ranches, stealing cattle and horses while leaving behind burned buildings and sometimes bodies. The newspapers had been full of their exploits for months, but they'd seemed like distant boogeymen, threats that belonged to someone else's world. Could be, Jake replied. Or could be Dalton Pierce finally making his move. Pierce? I thought. That was settled years ago. Nothing's ever settled with men like Pierce. He's been waiting for the right moment to come after me, and with all the new wealth from the railroad contracts. Jake's voice trailed off, then hardened. We knew this day would come eventually. Margaret heard footsteps moving away from the window and quickly returned to her desk, her hands shaking as she tried to refocus on the ledger columns. But the numbers blurred together as her mind raced with implications. She'd brought Claire to what she'd thought was safety, only to discover they'd landed in the middle of some kind of range war. The next morning brought an unwelcome visitor that confirmed Margaret's worst fears. She was working in the garden with Elena, teaching Claire how to identify different vegetables, when a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. As it grew closer, she could make out a single rider on a magnificent black stallion, moving with the confidence of someone who owned the world. Elena? Margaret asked quietly. Who is that? Elena's face had gone pale. Senator Pierce. Dios mío, what does he want here? Jake emerged from the barn as the rider approached, his posture alert, but not overtly threatening. Margaret noticed, however, that Sam Carter and two other hands had appeared from various buildings, all within easy reach of their work areas, but clearly positioned to respond to trouble. Dalton Pierce was a man who commanded attention without effort. Tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair and expensive clothes that somehow managed to look practical, he radiated the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. His horse was clearly worth more than most people earned in a year, and the gun at his hip was worn with the casual ease of long familiarity. Morrison, Pierce called out as he reined in his mount. Heard you've been making some interesting acquisitions lately. His eyes found Margaret. Immediately, scanning her with the same calculating assessment she remembered from the auction house. But this time, the examination felt different, not like a potential buyer evaluating merchandise, but like a predator sizing up someone else's territory. Pierce, Jake replied evenly. I wasn't expecting company. Oh, I think you were. Word travels fast in this territory, especially when someone starts throwing around serious money in the city. Pierce's smile was all teeth and no warmth. $800 for a factory woman and her brat? That's either remarkable generosity or remarkable stupidity. Margaret felt Claire press against her side, the little girl instinctively recognizing the menace in Pierce's tone. Elena placed a protective hand on Claire's shoulder, her own fear carefully controlled but visible to anyone who knew how to look. My business is my own, Jake said. Normally, yes. But when your business starts affecting the local balance of power, it becomes everyone's concern. Pierce dismounted with fluid grace, his movement suggesting deadly competence beneath the civilized exterior. See, I've been trying to acquire this particular piece of land for some time now. Your continued prosperity makes that ... complicated. The ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale, Morrison. It's just a matter of price. Pierce's eyes drifted back to Margaret. Though I admit, I'm curious about your new bookkeeper. Heard. She's quite the beauty under all that chopped-off hair. The casual cruelty of the comment made Margaret's cheeks burn with shame and anger. Pierce knew exactly what her shorn hair meant, knew she'd been processed through the same system that had destroyed countless other women, and he was using that knowledge as a weapon. Jake stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his gun. I think this conversation is over. Is it? Pierce remounted his horse with the same fluid grace. Because I think it's just getting started. You see, I've made certain arrangements with our mutual friends in the city. Turns out your bookkeepers' debts weren't quite as settled as you thought. Margaret's blood turned to ice. What do you mean? Pierce's smile widened. Simple economics, my dear. The mill has decided there was additional damage beyond what was initially assessed. Damaged equipment, lost productivity, penalties for breach of contract. The total comes to quite a bit. More than what Morrison paid. That's not possible, Margaret said, but even as she spoke, she knew it was entirely possible. The system that had trapped her once could easily trap her again, especially if someone with Pierce's resources was pulling the strings. Oh, but it is. And since you're currently in default on those additional obligations, Pierce shrugged. Eloquently. Well, let's just say there are people very interested in collecting what's owed. Jake's voice was deadly quiet. Get off my land, certainly. But Morrison, you might want to consider my offer more seriously. Because if you don't sell to me voluntarily, I'm afraid your bookkeeper and her charming daughter might find themselves back in the city, dealing with creditors who are far less civilized than I am. Pierce wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the acrid taste of fear in everyone's mouths. Elena, take Claire inside, Jake said tersely. Margaret, we need to talk. In the office with the door firmly closed, Jake began pulling papers from a locked drawer Margaret hadn't even known existed. Bills of sale, legal documents, correspondence, the hidden machinery of a man who'd been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. How much of what he said is true? Margaret asked. All of it, probably. Pierce has connections throughout the territory, including judges and officials who owe him favors. If he wants to manufacture additional debt in your name, he can do it. Margaret sank into a chair, the weight of renewed helplessness crushing down on her. So we're back where we started. No, Jake's voice was firm. We're exactly where I expected to be eventually. Pierce has been circling this ranch like a vulture for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to strike. I just didn't expect him to use you as leverage. Why does he want your land so badly? Jake spread a map on the desk, pointing to various marked locations. Railroad's coming through next year, and my property sits right in the path of the most valuable route. Pierce has been buying up surrounding ranches, probably planning to sell the whole package to the railroad for 10 times what he paid. Margaret studied the map, seeing the strategic importance immediately. How much is the land worth? To the railroad? Probably $500,000, maybe more. To Pierce, once he consolidates it all, could be worth millions? The numbers were staggering. Margaret had never imagined being involved in conflicts over such vast sums of money. Her entire previous existence had been measured in dollars and cents, not hundreds of thousands. What do? We fight. Jake's expression was grim but determined. I've been preparing for this confrontation for years. Pierce thinks he holds all the cards, but he doesn't know about some of the arrangements I've made. That evening, Margaret found herself in an emergency meeting with Jake's inner circle, Sam Carter, Elena, and 3 other ranch hands who apparently served roles beyond simple cattle work. The atmosphere was tense but focused, like a military planning session. Boss, we got confirmation on those tracks, Sam reported. Definitely the Dawson gang, and they're camped about 10 miles south. Pierce must have hired them for intimidation. Or worse, added Ben Rodriguez, Elena's nephew and one of the younger hands. Word is they're not just rustlers anymore. They've graduated to robbery and kidnapping. The implication hung heavy in the air. Claire was asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware that she'd become a pawn in a much larger and deadlier game. What about the sheriff? Margaret asked. Sheriff Bradley's a good man, but he's got 1 deputy and a territory the size of Rhode Island to cover, Sam explained. Even if he wanted to help, which he does, he can't be everywhere at once. Jake studied the map again, tracing routes with his finger. We need to get word to my contact in the territorial capital. If Pierce is manipulating legal documents, we Need to challenge that through proper channels. That could take weeks, Elena protested. And in the meantime, we protect what's ours. Jake's voice carried absolute conviction. Margaret, I need you to write some letters tonight. Detailed accounts of everything that happened in the city. Every document Pierce might be falsifying. Every person involved in your original debt situation. Who am I writing to? Federal investigators. It turns out Pierce's activities have attracted attention from some very powerful people in Washington. If we can prove he's been manipulating the legal system for personal gain. Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. We can expose him. More than that, we can destroy him. But it means putting you and Claire at significant risk while we gather the evidence. Margaret looked around the room at these people who had become her unexpected allies. Sam Carter, weathered and tough but fundamentally decent. Elena, whose kindness had never wavered despite the growing danger. Ben Rodriguez, young but fierce in his loyalty to the ranch family. And Jake Morrison, the mysterious man who had saved them and was now risking everything to protect them. What kind of risk? She asked. Pierce won't wait for legal challenges to work their way through the system, Jake said bluntly. He'll escalate. More pressure, more threats, possibly direct action against the ranch or against you personally. Margaret thought of Claire, finally happy and safe for the first time in years. Then she thought of all the other women and children trapped in the same system that had nearly destroyed them both. If we expose Pierce, does it help others like U.S.? Absolutely. His operation extends far beyond just land acquisition. He's been trafficking women and children throughout the territory, using debt manipulation and legal corruption to feed a network that reaches into several states. The scope of it was overwhelming, but Margaret found herself thinking with startling clarity. For 2 years she'd been reactive, always responding to crises rather than controlling her own fate. This was her chance to fight back, not just for herself and Claire, but for everyone Pierce had victimized. What do you need me to do? Jake smiled for the first time that day. Write those letters. Document everything. And trust that we're going to see this through together, no matter what Pierce throws at us. As the meeting broke up and Margaret returned to her desk to begin the long night of writing ahead, she realized something fundamental had changed. She was no longer a victim seeking safety. She had become a combatant in a war she was determined to win. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch continued, cattle settling, horses moving in their paddocks, the distant call of a coyote. But underneath those familiar sounds, Margaret could hear something else, the faint rhythm of men on watch, guards protecting something worth fighting for. She dipped her pen in ink and began to write, each word a small act of defiance against the system that had tried to break her. By morning, she would have documented a story of corruption and cruelty that reached from the tenements of the city to the highest levels of territorial government. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch boundaries, dangerous men were making plans of their own, unaware that their intended victims had just transformed into their most formidable opponents. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday, 3 days after Margaret had sent her carefully documented letters to the federal investigators. She woke to the sound of gunfire and men shouting, followed immediately by Elena's urgent voice outside her door. Margaret! Quickly, bring Claire to the root cellar. Margaret threw on her robe and rushed to Claire's room, finding her daughter already awake and trembling at the window. In the gray pre-dawn light, she could see muzzle flashes from the tree line beyond the main pasture. Dark figures on horseback were circling the ranch buildings, firing sporadically but not seeming to aim at anything specific. It's just noise, Margaret told Claire, trying to keep her voice steady. They're trying to scare us. But as they hurried down the back stairs following Elena's lead, Margaret could see this was more than intimidation. The attackers had clearly studied the ranch layout, knowing exactly where to position themselves for maximum psychological impact. While staying out of range of return fire from the defenders, the root cellar was a stone-lined chamber beneath the kitchen, originally built for storing vegetables, but now serving as an impromptu bunker. Elena had already prepared it with blankets, water, and oil lamps. As they settled into the cramped space, Margaret could hear Jake's voice shouting orders above them. "Sam, take the south wall. Ben, you and Tommy cover the barn. Let them waste their ammunition. They can't keep this up all morning." The gunfire continued for nearly an hour, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the ringing silence that followed, Margaret could hear her own heartbeat and Claire's rapid breathing beside her. "Are they gone?" Claire whispered. Before anyone could answer, they heard footsteps above, then Jake's voice calling down. "All clear. You can come up now." The ranch yard looked like a battlefield. Bullet holes pocked the sides of buildings, windows were shattered, and several horses in the corral were skittish from the noise. But as Margaret looked around, she realized the destruction was carefully controlled, enough to terrify, but not enough to actually cripple the operation. "Anyone hurt?" she asked Jake as he reloaded his rifle. "Couple of scratches from flying splinters, nothing serious." They weren't trying to kill anyone. This was a message. The message became clearer, an hour later when a lone rider approached under a white flag. It wasn't Pierce himself, but a man Margaret recognized from the auction house, the short, stocky enforcer who had helped arrange her original capture. He carried a leather satchel and wore the confident smirk of someone delivering an ultimatum. "Morrison," he called out when he was still 50 yards away. "I got a proposition for you." Jake emerged from the house, his rifle held casually but ready. "State your business and get off my land." The man dismounted and approached slowly, hands visible and away from his weapons. "Name's Curtis Webb. I work for Mr. Pierce, and he's authorized me to make you a generous offer. I'm listening." Webb opened his satchel and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. "Legal documents. Seems your bookkeeper's debts are more complicated than originally thought. Mills filed additional claims. There's interest and penalties, legal fees." He shrugged. "It's about $3,000 now." Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. It was an impossible sum that could keep her trapped forever. "However," Webb continued, "Mr. Pierce is willing to forgive the entire debt, plus offer you $50,000 cash for the ranch. You'd walk away free and clear, with enough money to start over anywhere you want." Jake didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the tree line where the morning's attackers had positioned themselves. "And if I refuse? Well, that would be unfortunate. See, those debts are legally enforceable, and Mr. Pierce has connections with certain collection agencies that are very thorough in their methods." Webb's smile was pure malice. "Course, accidents happen during collection activities. People get hurt, sometimes killed. Children especially are vulnerable during such unfortunate incidents." The threat was unmistakable. Margaret felt rage building in her chest, not the helpless anger of the powerless, but the focused fury of someone who had found her strength and wasn't about to give it up. "You have 1 hour to consider the offer," Webb announced, remounting his horse. "After that, Mr. Pierce's patience runs out, and things get considerably less civilized." As Webb rode away, Margaret found herself looking at the ranch with new eyes. This wasn't just about land or money anymore. It was about whether decent people could stand up to corruption and cruelty, or whether the Curtis Webbs and Dalton Pierces of the world would always win through intimidation and violence. "Jake," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." In the office with Sam Carter and Elena present, Margaret revealed something she'd discovered while researching Pierce's operations for her letters to the federal investigators. "I found records of other ranches Pierce has acquired over the past 5 years. The pattern is always the same: financial pressure, legal manipulation, then escalating violence until the owners sell or abandon their properties. She spread several documents across the desk. But here's what's interesting. In every case, there was someone like me, a woman with manufactured debts, placed on the property shortly before Pierce made his move. Jake studied the papers with growing understanding. You think he's been using trafficked women as leverage against property owners? More than that. I think he's been placing them strategically, using their debts as legal weapons to force sales. Margaret pointed to specific entries in her research. Look at the timeline. Woman arrives at ranch, debts mysteriously increase. Property owner faces impossible choice, pay crushing debt or lose everything. Sam Carter whistled low. That's not just land grabbing. That's a systematic operation. Which means, Elena added thoughtfully, there are other women like Margaret trapped in this same web. Margaret nodded grimly. At least 6 that I've documented, probably more. Pierce has turned human trafficking into a tool for corporate acquisition. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the network of connections Margaret had mapped out. The federal investigators you wrote to, when might we hear back? Could be weeks, could be months. Federal bureaucracy moves slowly, even for serious crimes. We don't have weeks, Sam pointed out. Pierce wants an answer in an hour. Margaret stood up, her decision crystallizing with startling clarity. Then we give him one. That afternoon, Margaret found herself riding alongside Jake toward Pierce's sprawling mansion on the hill overlooking the valley. She'd insisted on coming despite the obvious danger, arguing that as the center of Pierce's leverage, she needed to be part of whatever confrontation was coming. Pierce's estate was impressive, in a way that spoke of new money trying to impress old money sensibilities. The house itself was a massive Victorian monstrosity, all towers and gingerbread trim, surrounded by manicured gardens that looked out of place in the rugged landscape. Pierce himself met them on the front steps, flanked by Webb and 2 other men who were clearly professional gunfighters. His smile was triumphant as he watched them approach. Morrison, I wasn't sure you'd be sensible enough to accept reality, but I'm pleased to see you've come to your senses. Jake dismounted but kept his hand near his weapon. We're here to talk, not to surrender. Oh, but talking is surrendering, isn't it? The moment you agreed to come here, you acknowledged that I hold all the cards. Pierce's eyes shifted to Margaret. And you, my dear, must be eager to resolve your unfortunate debt situation. Margaret had spent the ride preparing for this moment, rehearsing the words that would either save them or doom them all. Actually, Mr. Pierce, I'm here to make you an offer. Pierce's smile faltered slightly. I beg your pardon? You see, while researching my supposed debts, I discovered some interesting inconsistencies in the paperwork. Dates that don't match. Signatures that appear to be forged. Legal documents that reference laws that don't actually exist. Margaret's voice was steady, professional. In fact, I found similar inconsistencies in documents related to at least 6 other properties you've acquired in recent years. The color began draining from Pierce's face. You're fishing. You have no proof of anything. Actually, I do. Detailed documentation, witness statements, financial records that show the same pattern of debt manipulation repeated across multiple cases. Margaret opened her saddlebag and pulled out a thick folder, all of which has been forwarded to federal investigators, who specialize in territorial corruption and human trafficking. Webb stepped forward, his hand moving toward his gun, but Pierce held up a restraining hand. His calculating mind was clearly working through the implications. Even if that were true, Pierce said carefully, federal investigations take time. And accidents can happen to witnesses before they have a chance to testify. They can, Jake agreed, speaking for the first time since dismounting. But it's harder to silence witnesses when they're already in protective custody. Pierce's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction as she delivered the killing blow. The women you've been using as debt leverage against property owners? We found them, all of them. And as of yesterday, they're all in federal custody, ready to testify about how they were trafficked, how their debts were manufactured, and how they were used as weapons against innocent property owners. The silence that followed was deafening. Pierce's face cycled through several emotions: disbelief, rage, and finally, cold calculation. "You're bluffing," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Test me," Margaret replied. "Continue. With your threats, escalate your violence, try to collect your fabricated debts. See how far you get when federal marshals are already building cases against you." Pierce looked around at his men, clearly weighing his options. Violence was still possible. He could have them both killed here and now, claim self-defense, or simply make them disappear. But if Margaret was telling the truth about federal involvement, such actions would only make his situation worse. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Simple," Jake replied. "You withdraw all claims against Margaret and any other women you've trafficked. You cease all activities against my ranch and any other properties in this territory. And you disappear. Permanently. And if I refuse?" Margaret smiled for the first time since arriving. "Then you can explain to a federal judge why your operation bears such striking similarities to organized crime syndicates the government has been working to dismantle across the Western territories." Pierce was quiet for nearly a minute, his mind clearly racing through scenarios and outcomes. Finally, he nodded slowly. "It seems you've been more thorough than I anticipated," he admitted. "Very well. Consider our business." But as they turned to leave, Margaret caught something in Pierce's expression that made her blood run cold. This wasn't surrender, it was tactical retreat. Men like Pierce didn't simply give up when cornered. They regrouped and struck back harder. The ride back to the ranch was tense, both Margaret and Jake aware that they'd won a battle, but not the war. Pierce would need time to reassess his position, but he wouldn't simply disappear as they'd demanded. Men with his resources and connections didn't vanish quietly into the night. How much of what we told him was true? Jake asked as they neared the ranch buildings. "About the federal investigation?" "All of it. About finding other women?" Margaret hesitated. "That part was more aspirational." Jake chuckled grimly. "So we're gambling that we can make our bluff reality before Pierce figures out we're running ahead of our evidence." "Exactly. Which means we need to work fast." That evening, as Margaret sat at her desk writing urgent letters to every federal contact she could think of, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible morning in the tenement building. She was no longer the desperate woman who had accepted any terms to survive. She had become someone who fought back, someone who used her mind as a weapon against those who preyed on the vulnerable. But she also knew the most dangerous part of their confrontation with Pierce was yet to come. Cornered predators were always at their most deadly, and Pierce had too much at stake to simply accept defeat. Outside her window, she could see Jake and his men maintaining their watch, rifles ready, eyes scanning the darkness for signs of threat. The ranch felt like a fortress under siege, but it was their fortress, and they would defend it with everything they had. The real test was still ahead. Margaret's gamble paid off, in ways she never could have anticipated. 2 days after their confrontation with Pierce, a telegraph arrived that changed everything. Federal marshals were already en route to the territory, armed with warrants and evidence that went far beyond what Margaret had managed to uncover. Message came from Deputy Marshal Catherine Walsh, a name Margaret didn't recognize, but who clearly knew details about their situation that no stranger should possess. The telegraph was brief but electrifying, arriving Thursday, with warrants. Pierce operation compromised at highest levels. Maintain security until arrival. Jake studied the message with a frown. How does a federal marshal know about our situation? Already? We only sent those letters 3 days ago. Margaret felt pieces clicking together in her mind. Unless they were already investigating Pierce before we contacted them. What if our letters just provided the final evidence they needed? The answer came that very afternoon in an unexpected form. A well-dressed woman in her 30s arrived at the ranch in a government carriage, flanked by two deputy marshals who looked like they could handle themselves in any situation. The woman introduced herself as Deputy Marshal Catherine Walsh, and within minutes of meeting her, Margaret understood why Pierce's operation had finally been exposed. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't tell you how relieved I am to find you safe," Marshal Walsh said as they sat in Jake's office. "We've been tracking Pierce's trafficking network for 8 months, but we've never had witnesses willing to testify. How did you know to look for me here?" Walsh exchanged a glance with Jake before answering. "Because Mr. Morrison has been our inside source from the beginning." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She turned to stare at Jake, seeing him with completely new eyes. "You're a federal agent?" Jake corrected quietly. "I retired from active service 3 years ago after my wife and daughter died. But when the Marshal Service asked me to help investigate Pierce's operation, I couldn't refuse." Margaret's mind raced back through every interaction they'd had, reinterpreting conversations and actions in this new light. "The auction house. You weren't there by chance?" "No, we'd been tracking the shipment of trafficked women, following the money trail that led back to Pierce's land acquisition scheme. When I learned you were being sold and that you had a child," Jake's voice trailed off, "I couldn't let the investigation proceed if it meant leaving you and Claire in danger." Marshal Walsh leaned forward. "What Jake isn't telling you is that, by intervening, he nearly compromised 18 months of undercover work. His superiors were displeased." "I told them to find another way," Jake said firmly. "Some things matter more than investigations." Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude, anger, confusion, and something deeper that she wasn't ready to examine. "So everything that's happened, bringing us here, the ranch, all of it, it was just part of your investigation?" "No." Jake's response was immediate and emphatic. "The investigation brought me to that auction house, but what I did after that was personal. Buying your freedom, bringing you both here, offering you a real home that had nothing to do with federal law enforcement." Marshal Walsh consulted her pocket watch. "As touching as this reunion is, we have urgent business to discuss. Pierce knows his operation is compromised, and according to our intelligence, he's planning something desperate." She spread a map on the desk, marked with red pins and connecting lines that showed the scope of Pierce's criminal network. "This isn't just about land acquisition anymore. Pierce has been using his trafficking operation to blackmail territorial officials, judges, and railroad executives. He's accumulated enough compromising information to bring down the entire territorial government if he chooses to use it." Jake studied the map grimly. "Meaning he's not going to simply disappear quietly." "Exactly. Our sources indicate he's preparing to eliminate key witnesses and destroy evidence before fleeing to Mexico. That includes both of you, and probably everyone on this ranch who could testify about his activities." Margaret felt cold fear settle in her stomach. "What about the other women, the ones we told Pierce we'd found?" "That's our biggest problem," Walsh admitted. "We've located 3 of the 6 women you identified, but they're terrified and scattered. Without their testimony, our case against Pierce's trafficking operation falls apart. And without that testimony," Jake added, "he walks away free to start the same operation somewhere else." Margaret looked at the map, seeing not just Pierce's criminal network, but the lives it had destroyed, women like herself who had been ground up in a system designed to exploit their desperation. The thought of Pierce escaping to victimize others filled her with determination. "What if we could get them to come forward? The other women?" Marshal Walsh shook her head. "We've tried. They're too frightened, and frankly, they have good reason to be. Pierce's people have already killed 2 potential witnesses in other territories. But they might listen to someone who's been through the same experience, Margaret insisted. Someone who understands what they've suffered and can prove that fighting back is possible. Jake caught her meaning immediately. Margaret, that would put you in incredible danger. If Pierce learns you're contacting his other victims. He's already planning to kill us anyway, Margaret pointed out. At least this way, we might save others and ensure he faces justice. Marshal Walsh considered this carefully. It's not without precedent. Victim testimony has been crucial in breaking similar networks, but the risks ... double quotes. I understand the risks. I also understand what it's like to feel trapped and helpless, with no one willing to help. Margaret's voice grew stronger. If I can convince even one of those women to testify, isn't that worth trying? The next morning, Margaret found herself on a train bound for Denver, accompanied by 2 undercover marshals and carrying identity papers that identified her as a government social worker. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Locate the 3 women they'd identified, convince them that Pierce's network had been compromised, and offer them federal protection in exchange. For testimony, the first woman, Sarah Mitchell, had been traced to a boarding house in Denver's Factory District. According to Marshal Walsh's intelligence, Sarah had escaped from a ranch near Colorado Springs where she'd been held under a debt arrangement. Similar to Margaret's original situation, Margaret found Sarah working in a laundry, her hands red and raw from harsh chemicals, her face bearing the hollow look of someone who had given up hope. The initial conversation was difficult. Sarah was suspicious of anyone asking questions, and her first instinct was to flee when Margaret mentioned Pierce's name. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah insisted, glancing nervously around. The steamy laundry room. I don't know any Pierce. I know you're frightened, Margaret said gently. 6 weeks ago, I was in the exact same position. Trapped by manufactured debts, sold at auction, placed on a ranch where I was supposed to be leverage against the property owner. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, recognition, perhaps hope. How did you get away? Margaret spent the next hour telling Sarah her story, leaving out nothing. The desperation, the auction house, the fear, and finally, the discovery that she didn't have to accept her situation as inevitable. By the end, Sarah was crying quietly, her carefully maintained emotional defenses finally cracking. They told me my debt was over $3,000 now, Sarah whispered. Said I'd never pay it off, that I belonged to them forever. They told me the same thing. But it was all lies, fabricated documents, forged signatures, legal papers that referenced laws that don't exist. Margaret pulled out copies of the evidence she'd compiled. Look at this. The same handwriting on documents supposedly signed by different officials. The same legal language copied word for word across multiple cases. Sarah studied the papers with growing amazement. This is exactly what they showed me. The same forms, just with my name instead of yours. Because it's all fake. They're using the same template, the same lies, to trap women across the entire territory. Margaret leaned forward. Sarah, federal marshals are building a case that could shut down this entire operation. But they need testimony from women who lived through it. The conversation with Sarah lasted 3 hours, but by the end, she had agreed to return with Margaret to testify. The second woman, found in a factory town outside Denver, required similar convincing but eventually agreed. When she learned that 2 other women were already willing to testify, the third woman, however, presented a more complex challenge. Lisa Parker had been moved recently, and tracking her was required following a trail of debt transfers and property sales that led to a remote ranch owned by one of Pierce's associates. Margaret's undercover marshal escorts were reluctant to approach the ranch directly, but Margaret insisted that abandoning Lisa wasn't acceptable. She's trapped in exactly the same situation I was 6 weeks ago. If we don't help her, who will? The ranch where Lisa was being held was smaller than Jake's operation, but run with the same systematic cruelty Margaret remembered from her research. Lisa was essentially a prisoner, kept under guard and forced to work in conditions that were clearly designed to break her spirit. Getting access to Lisa required Margaret to pose as a potential buyer, a wealthy widow looking to purchase domestic help for her own property. The deception was risky, but it worked long enough for Margaret to have a private conversation with Lisa while pretending to evaluate her qualifications. "Listen to me carefully," Margaret whispered while the ranch foreman was distracted. "I'm not here to buy you. I'm here to get you out, but I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say." Lisa's eyes widened with desperate hope, but also fear. "They'll kill me if I try to run." "They're going to kill you anyway eventually. But right now, federal marshals are waiting half a mile down the road. All you have to do is walk to the outhouse and keep walking into the woods. Can you do that?" The escape plan worked, but just barely. Lisa made it to the federal marshals, but not before the ranch foreman realized she was missing and sent riders to search for her. Margaret and her escorts had to abandon their careful approach and fight their way out in a running gun battle that left 2 of Pierce's men wounded and served notice that the federal investigation was no longer covert. The train ride back to Jake's territory was tense with the knowledge that Pierce now knew exactly how much trouble he was in. But Margaret felt a deep satisfaction as she looked at the 3 women sitting with her, Sarah, Maria, and Lisa, all of whom had agreed to testify in exchange for federal protection and the promise that their manufactured debts would be legally voided. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they neared their destination. "Now we finish what we started," Margaret replied. "We make sure Pierce and everyone involved in this operation face justice. And we make sure no other women have to go through what we've experienced." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew the most dangerous part of their mission was still ahead. Pierce was cornered now, with federal warrants pending and key witnesses ready to testify. Men in his position didn't surrender quietly. They fought back with everything they had, regardless of who got hurt in the process. As the train pulled into the station near Jake's ranch, Margaret could see smoke rising from the direction of the property. Her blood ran cold as she realized that while she'd been rescuing Pierce's other victims, he had been preparing his final desperate counterattack. The war between them was about to reach its climax, and Margaret was no longer certain that right would triumph over might. But she was certain of one thing: she would never again be the helpless victim who accepted whatever fate others chose for her. Whatever came next, she would face it as someone who fought back. The smoke Margaret had seen from the train wasn't from the main ranch buildings being burned. It was from something far more sinister. As their carriage raced toward Jake's property, she could see through the growing dusk that the house and barns were intact, but a smaller structure near the eastern boundary was engulfed in flames. "That's the old bunkhouse," one of the federal marshals observed grimly. "The one Jake converted into temporary housing for ... He didn't need to finish." Margaret's blood turned to ice as she realized what Pierce had done. The building that had been prepared to house the women who would testify against him was now a smoking ruin, and there was no way to know if anyone had been inside when it caught fire. They found Jake and his men fighting the blaze with bucket brigades, but it was clear the building was a total loss. What was worse, Claire was nowhere to be seen, and Elena stood at the edge of the firelight with tears streaming down her face. "Where's Claire?" Margaret demanded, jumping from the carriage before it had fully stopped. "Safe," Jake replied immediately, his face blackened with soot. "I sent her with Tommy Walsh to the Martinez Ranch as soon as we spotted riders approaching." "But Margaret ... His expression grew grave. "They left something for you." Elena held out a piece of paper, her hands trembling. Margaret recognized Pierce's expensive stationery immediately, but the message was written in Curtis Webb's crude handwriting. "Mrs. Henderson, You have 24 hours to bring yourself and they'll fly. 3 whores you stole to the old mining camp north of Eagle Ridge. Come alone, or we start sending pieces of other people you care about. We know where the little girl is hiding." The threat was unmistakable. Pierce had escalated beyond property disputes and legal maneuvering to direct kidnapping threats. More chilling was the implication that he had people watching the Martinez ranch where Claire was supposedly safe. "How many men does he have?" Deputy Marshal Walsh asked Jake. "Hard to say. The Dawson gang is at least 8 strong, plus Webb and whoever else Pierce has recruited. Could be 15, could be 20. Jake reloaded his rifle with practiced efficiency. The mining camp he mentioned is perfect for an ambush. Narrow approaches, high ground all around, plenty of places to position shooters. It's obviously a trap, Walsh pointed out. He has no intention of letting any of you leave that camp alive. Margaret studied the note again, her mind working through possibilities. Maybe, but he's also desperate now. He knows federal warrants are coming, knows his entire operation is compromised. This might be his only chance to eliminate the witnesses against him. Sarah Mitchell, who had been silent during the ride from town, suddenly spoke up. "He'll kill us whether we go or not. At least if we go, we might have a chance to fight back." "No," Jake said firmly. "I'm not putting any of you in that kind of danger. We'll find another way." But Margaret was studying the note more carefully, noticing details that others had missed. "Look at this." The handwriting changes in the middle. Starts as Webb's crude script, but the last sentence is different. More educated, more careful. "Marshall." Walsh examined the paper. "You're right. 2 different writers. Which means Pierce is there, personally overseeing this. He's not delegating anymore. He's desperate enough to put himself at risk." Margaret felt a plan beginning to form. What if we use that against him? The plan that emerged over the next several hours was audacious, dangerous, and their only real hope of ending Pierce's threat permanently. Instead of simply attempting to arrest him through normal law enforcement channels, which would be nearly impossible given his political connections and the remote location, they would turn his own trap against him. Margaret would go to the mining camp as demanded, but not alone and not defenseless. Jake and a team of federal marshals would position themselves around the camp before she arrived, and when Pierce revealed himself to gloat over his captured witnesses, they would have him surrounded with no possibility of escape. The biggest risk, Marshal Walsh explained as they finalized the details, is that Pierce might kill you the moment you arrive, before we can intervene. "He won't," Margaret replied with more confidence than she felt. "He's spent too much time and effort setting this up. He'll want to savor the victory, explain how clever he's been, probably try to get information about what evidence we have. His ego won't let him just shoot me without a speech." Sarah, Maria, and Lisa had insisted on being part of the plan despite the obvious danger. "We've been running and hiding for months," Lisa explained. "This is our chance to face him on our terms instead of his." As dawn approached, Margaret found herself riding toward Eagle Ridge with the 3 other women, all of them armed and all of them fully aware that they might not survive the next few hours. Behind them, invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, Jake and 8 federal marshals were moving into position around the old mining camp. The camp itself was a remnant from the territory's gold rush days, a collection of abandoned buildings clustered around played-out mine shafts. It occupied a small valley surrounded by rocky hills that provided excellent cover for observers or shooters. As Margaret approached the entrance to the valley, she could see why Pierce had chosen it. Anyone entering would be completely exposed, while defenders would have multiple elevated positions from which to control the area. "Remember," she told the other women as they dismounted at the valley entrance, "our job is to get Pierce talking and keep him talking until Jake can get into position. Don't provoke him unnecessarily, but don't appear too submissive either. He'll be suspicious if we seem too cooperative." They walked into the valley on foot, leading their horses and maintaining the appearance of reluctant compliance with Pierce's demands. The silence was oppressive. No bird songs, no insect sounds, just the crunch of gravel under their feet and the distant sound of wind through abandoned buildings. Pierce was waiting for them in what had once been the camp's main office building, a two-story structure that commanded a view of the entire valley. He stood on the second-floor balcony like a king holding court, flanked by Webb and two other gunmen Margaret didn't recognize. "Mrs. Henderson," Pierce called out in a voice that dripped false bonhomie. "How punctual of you. And you brought my wayward property with you. Excellent." Margaret forced herself to remain calm as Pierce's casual reference to the other women as property sent rage coursing through her veins. "We're here. Now what?" "Now we discuss the terms of your surrender." Pierce descended the stairs slowly, clearly enjoying the theatrical nature of the moment. "You see, federal investigations are all well and good, but they require living witnesses to be effective." As Pierce spoke, Margaret caught glimpses of movement in the rocks above the camp, Jake and his men getting into position. She needed to keep Pierce talking long enough for them to surround the area completely. "What makes you think we'll just give up?" she asked. "We've come this far." "Because, my dear, you have no choice. Even as we speak, my associates are retrieving your charming daughter from her hiding place. Such a sweet child. It would be tragic if something happened to her, due to her mother's stubbornness." The threat against Claire was exactly what Margaret had expected, but hearing it spoken aloud still made her heart race. "You're lying. She's safe." Pierce smiled and gestured to one of his men, who produced a small piece of cloth, part of Claire's dress, torn and stained with what looked like blood. "Am I?" Pierce's smile was pure malice. "Children are so fragile, so vulnerable to accidents. Of course, she's still alive for now, but that situation could change very quickly depending on how cooperative you choose to be." Margaret felt the world tilt around her as rage and terror warred in her chest. But she also noticed something Pierce apparently hadn't. The piece of cloth was from an old dress, one Claire had outgrown weeks ago. Either Pierce's men had grabbed the wrong item, or this was an elaborate bluff designed to break her resolve. "What do you want?" she asked, buying time while scanning the surrounding hills for signs that Jake was in position. "Simple. You and these three sluts will confess that your testimonies were fabricated, that you were paid by my enemies to make false accusations. You'll sign statements to that effect, and then—" Pierce shrugged eloquently. "Well, then you'll have served your purpose." Sarah stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "We'll never sign anything for you, you monster." Pierce's expression darkened. "Oh, but you will. Because the alternative is watching me demonstrate exactly what happened to the last women who refused to cooperate." He gestured again, and two more of his men emerged from the building, dragging something between them, a wooden crate that they dumped unceremoniously at the women's feet. The lid fell open, revealing contents that made Maria scream and step backward in horror. "Her name was Catherine Walsh," Pierce said conversationally. "She was supposed to testify against me in Colorado Springs. Unfortunately, she had an accident before she could appear in court." Margaret realized with sick certainty that the remains in the box belonged to the missing fourth woman they'd never been able to locate. Pierce had kept the evidence of his murder as a tool for intimidating other potential witnesses. "You're insane," Lisa whispered. "I'm practical," Pierce corrected. "Dead witnesses can't testify. But sometimes living witnesses need to be reminded of how easily they can become dead witnesses." It was at that moment that everything went wrong. A rifle shot echoed across the valley, followed immediately by shouts and the sound of men scrambling over rocks. One of Pierce's lookouts had spotted Jake's federal marshals, and the carefully planned surprise had turned into an open gunfight. Well, Pierce said, his voice remaining calm despite the chaos erupting around them. "It seems your friends decided to join the party uninvited." Webb already had his gun drawn and pointed at Margaret's chest. "Boss, we should finish them now and get out of here." But Pierce held up a restraining hand, his eyes bright with the excitement of a man who thrived on violence and chaos. "Not yet, Curtis. This is just getting interesting." Gunfire was echoing from multiple positions around the valley as Jake's men engaged Pierce's shooters in the rocks above. Margaret could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different locations, which meant Pierce had more men than they'd anticipated. "Here's what's going to happen," Pierce announced, raising his voice to be heard over the gunfire. "You 4 ladies are going to walk very slowly toward that mine shaft behind you. Any sudden movements, any attempts to run, and Curtis here will demonstrate his marksmanship skills." Margaret looked toward the mine shaft Pierce had indicated, a dark opening in the hillside that led down into what had once been active digging operations. It would be a perfect place to dispose of bodies, and she realized with crystal clarity that Pierce had never intended to let any of them leave this valley alive. The testimonies, the confessions, the threats against Claire, all of it had been theater designed to bring them here where they could be eliminated without witnesses. Pierce's real plan had always been to kill them all and disappear across the border before federal authorities could track him down. "You're going to murder us either way," Margaret said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Why should we cooperate?" Pierce's smile was genuinely warm, as if she'd asked about the weather. "Because, my dear Mrs. Henderson, cooperation determines whether your deaths are quick and painless or slow and educational. The choice, as they say, is yours." The gunfight around them was intensifying, with shots now coming from multiple directions as more of Pierce's men revealed their positions. Margaret could hear Jake's voice shouting orders somewhere up in the rocks, but she couldn't tell if the federal marshals were winning or losing the battle. What she could tell was that she and the 3 other women were running out of time. Webb's gun never wavered from her chest, and Pierce's other men had positioned themselves to prevent any escape attempts. In a matter of minutes, they would be forced into that mine shaft, and Margaret had no illusions about what would happen once they were out of sight. That's when she remembered something Pierce didn't know about, something that might give them one last chance at survival if she could find the courage to take the most desperate gamble of her life. What Margaret remembered was something Jake had mentioned during their first tour of the ranch, his experience with mining operations during his early career as a territorial marshal. He'd told her that old gold mines were notorious for unstable support structures, and that even small explosions could cause catastrophic collapses. More importantly, she remembered seeing the mining equipment still scattered around the camp, including several crates marked with warnings about blasting powder that miners had abandoned when the claims played out. "Move," Webb commanded, gesturing toward the mine shaft with his pistol. "All of you start walking." Margaret took a step toward the mine opening, then stumbled deliberately, falling to one knee near one of the abandoned equipment crates. As she pretended to struggle back to her feet, her fingers found what she'd hoped to discover, a stick of dynamite that had been carelessly left behind by the last miners to work this claim. "Clumsy as well as stupid," Pierce observed with amusement. "Perhaps we should put you out of your misery quickly after all." Margaret palmed the dynamite and the small box of matches beside it, rising slowly with her hands positioned so that her body blocked Pierce's view of what she'd taken. The explosives were old, possibly unstable, but they represented the only chance she and the other women had of surviving the next few minutes. "Sarah," she said quietly, "when I give the signal, you and the others run for those rocks behind Pierce's men. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run." Sarah gave an almost imperceptible nod, understanding immediately that Margaret was planning something desperate. The gunfire around the valley was reaching a crescendo, with Jake's federal marshals apparently gaining ground against Pierce's shooters. Margaret could hear voices shouting orders from multiple directions, and the frequency of shots suggested that the battle was approaching its climax. Pierce, however, seemed entirely unconcerned with the fighting raging around his position. His attention was focused solely on the 4 women he considered his primary obstacles to escaping justice. "Enough delays," he announced. "Curtis, escort our guests into the mine. I want this finished before the federal cavalry arrives in force." Webb stepped forward, his gun steady and his expression showing the cold competence of a man who had killed before without hesitation. You heard him. Move toward the shaft, nice and slow. Margaret took another step forward, positioning herself between Webb and the other women. "Wait," she said, putting as much desperation into her voice as she could manage. "There's something else. Something about the federal investigation that you need to know." Pierce raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what might that be?" "They know about the railroad contracts, the bribes you paid to territorial officials, the falsified surveys, the murdered surveyors who discovered your land claims were fraudulent." Margaret was improvising frantically, but she could see Pierce's expression tightening with each accusation. "They have documents, witnesses, bank records that trace payments directly to you." "Impossible," Pierce said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Those records were destroyed. Were they? Or did you just think they were destroyed?" Margaret stepped closer to Pierce, drawing his attention away from the other women. "Did you really think the federal government would investigate a network like yours without having solid evidence first?" Behind Pierce, Margaret could see Sarah positioning herself near a pile of mining equipment that would provide cover when she gave the signal. Maria and Lisa were following Sarah's lead, subtly shifting their positions to maximize their chances of reaching safety. "You're lying," Webb said flatly. "Trying to buy time for your Marshall friends." "Maybe I am," Margaret admitted. "But can you afford to take that risk? If Pierce is wrong about how much evidence they have, you'll hang right alongside him." Webb's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and Margaret realized she'd found a crack in the criminal partnership. Webb was muscle, not a true believer, and the prospect of facing federal murder charges was clearly making him reconsider his loyalty. "She's trying to turn us against each other," Pierce said to Webb, but his voice carried a note of warning that suggested he wasn't entirely sure of his subordinate's continued allegiance. Margaret struck the match with her thumbnail, the sudden flare of light drawing everyone's attention. "No," she said clearly, "I'm trying to save our lives." She touched the flame to the dynamite's fuse and threw it as hard as she could toward the mine entrance, shouting, "Run!" At the same moment, the next few seconds stretched into an eternity of chaos and violence. Sarah, Maria, and Lisa scattered toward the rocks as Margaret had instructed, while Webb spun to track the thrown dynamite with his gun. Pierce dove for cover behind a mining cart, and his other men began shooting wildly. In all directions, Margaret threw herself sideways behind a pile of wooden crates as Webb's first shot splintered the wood inches from her head. The dynamite's fuse was burning down rapidly, and she could see Pierce screaming orders at his men while trying to reach a position where he could escape the coming explosion. The blast, when it came, was far more powerful than Margaret had anticipated. The old dynamite detonated with a roar that echoed across the entire valley, bringing down not just the mine entrance, but a substantial portion of the hillside above it. Rock and debris rained down on the camp, and the shock wave knocked everyone to the ground. Through the ringing in her ears, Margaret could hear Pierce shouting curses as he struggled to his feet. Webb was bleeding from a head wound, but still conscious, his gun searching for targets through the dust and smoke. "Find them," Pierce commanded. "Kill them all." But the explosion had achieved more than just creating chaos. The sound of gunfire from the surrounding hills had stopped abruptly, and Margaret could hear new voices approaching, Jake's voice, and others she recognized as federal marshals. "Pierce!" Jake's voice carried clearly across the devastated camp. "It's over. You're surrounded." Pierce's response was to grab Webb's rifle and begin shooting toward the sound of Jake's voice. "It's not over until I say it's over." Margaret realized that Pierce had crossed the line from calculated criminal to desperate madman. The destruction of his carefully planned trap, combined with the approaching federal forces, had pushed him beyond rational thought into pure survival instinct. She spotted Sarah crouched behind a boulder about 30 yards away, apparently uninjured, but pinned down by gunfire from one of Pierce's remaining men. Maria and Lisa were nowhere to be seen, which Margaret hoped meant they'd found better cover. Mrs. Henderson. Pierce's voice had taken on a sing-song quality that was more terrifying than his earlier coldness. "Where are you hiding, my dear? We still have business to conclude." Margaret knew she couldn't remain hidden indefinitely. Pierce's men were systematically searching the debris field, and it would only be a matter of time before they found her position. More importantly, she could hear sounds suggesting that Jake and his marshals were engaging Pierce's shooters in other parts of the camp, which meant the final confrontation was approaching rapidly. Taking a deep breath, Margaret rose from her hiding place with her hands visible. "I'm here, Pierce." Pierce turned toward her with a smile that was pure madness. "Excellent. I was afraid you might have been caught in that unfortunate explosion." Webb had positioned himself to cover Pierce's flank, his rifle trained on Margaret, but his eyes constantly scanning for threats from other directions. She could see that he was bleeding more heavily now, and his movements suggested he was fighting to remain conscious. "Your federal friends seem to have arrived," Pierce observed conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "No matter. Webb and I have faced worse odds before. Have you?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about how Pierce planned to escape from a valley surrounded by federal marshals. "Oh yes, you see, my dear, men like me don't build empires without planning for contingencies. There are escape routes from this valley that your marshal friends don't know about, routes that will have us across the Mexican border before they realize we've gone." Pierce began backing toward what looked like a natural formation in the rocks, but Margaret could now see it was actually a concealed path that led up and out of the valley. Webb followed, his rifle still trained on her, but his attention divided between watching for threats and helping his increasingly unstable employer. "Of course," Pierce continued, "I can't leave without completing our business. You've caused me considerable inconvenience, Mrs. Henderson, and I always collect on debts." He raised his pistol toward Margaret, and she found herself staring down the barrel with the strange calm that sometimes comes in moments of absolute crisis. She'd fought as hard as she could, saved 3 other women from Pierce's network, and contributed to exposing a criminal operation that had destroyed countless lives. If this was how her story ended, at least it would end with her standing rather than kneeling. The shot, when it came, was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the camp. But Margaret felt no impact, no pain. Instead, she saw Webb spinning away from Pierce with blood spreading across his chest. Jake Morrison stood on a ledge above them, his rifle already tracking toward Pierce for a second shot. Pierce fired wildly toward Jake's position, then turned and ran for the concealed path with the desperate speed of a man who knew his time had run out. "Margaret, stay down," Jake called as he scrambled down from his position to pursue Pierce. But Margaret was already moving, not away from the danger but toward it. She'd seen something Pierce apparently hadn't noticed in his desperation to escape. Sarah Mitchell had positioned herself near the escape route, armed with a rifle she'd taken from one of the fallen gunmen. Pierce reached the base of the concealed path and began climbing rapidly, his expensive clothes torn and his face streaked with dust and blood. He was perhaps 20 feet up the narrow trail when Sarah stepped into view above him, her rifle trained on his chest. "Remember me?" Sarah asked quietly. "Sarah Mitchell. You sold me to a ranch in Colorado Springs for $200. Pierce stopped climbing, his hands raised but his eyes calculating the distance between himself and the armed woman blocking his escape. "Sarah, my dear girl," he said in his most persuasive voice, "surely we can come to some arrangement. I have considerable resources, and you've suffered terribly. Let me make it up to you. Sarah's response was immediate and final. You already have. The rifle shot echoed across the valley with a finality that seemed to end more than just Pierce's life. It ended the terror and helplessness that had defined the existence of every woman caught in his network. Pierce's body tumbled back down. The Pathan came to rest at the base of the rocks, his expensive clothes torn and bloodied, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky he'd never see again. In the silence that followed, Margaret could hear the voices of federal marshals calling. All clear from various positions around the camp. The battle was over, and somehow, impossibly, the good guys had won. Jake reached Margaret first, pulling her into an embrace that spoke of relief and emotions too complex for words. Are you hurt? No. Scared, exhausted, but not hurt. Margaret looked around the destroyed camp. The others? Sarah's fine, obviously. Maria and Lisa made it to cover when the shooting started. They're shaken up but unhurt. Jake's expression grew serious. What about Claire? Pierce claimed his men had taken her. Margaret felt a surge of panic before remembering the evidence Pierce had shown her. It was a bluff. The piece of cloth he showed me was from an old dress, one she'd outgrown. He was lying about having her. As if summoned by her words, Margaret heard a familiar voice calling her name from the valley entrance. She turned to see Claire running toward her, flanked by Tommy Walsh and two other ranch hands who had clearly been guarding her. Throughout the confrontation, the reunion was everything Margaret had hoped for and feared she might never experience. Claire threw herself into her mother's arms, with the desperate intensity of a child who had been genuinely frightened for the first time in her young life. I heard the shooting, Claire sobbed against Margaret's shoulder. Tommy said you were fighting bad men and that I had to stay hidden until it was safe. It's safe now, sweetheart, Margaret whispered, holding her daughter close and marveling at how much had changed since that terrible morning in the tenement building. We're safe now. The aftermath was a blur of federal marshals' written statements and the systematic documentation of Pierce's criminal network. Margaret found herself at the center of what would become one of the largest federal prosecutions in territorial history, with her testimony and evidence serving as the foundation for cases that would send dozens of Pierce's associates to prison. But more satisfying than the legal victories was the letter she received 6 months later from a woman named Catherine Walsh, not the murdered woman whose remains Pierce had used to terrorize them, but her sister, a federal prosecutor who had been instrumental in dismantling Pierce's entire operation. Mrs. Henderson, the letter read, I wanted you to know that the network you helped expose has been completely eliminated. 43 arrests have been made, and we've identified and freed nearly 200 women who were trapped in various debt slavery arrangements throughout the territory. Your courage in coming forward saved more lives than you'll ever know. Margaret read the letter aloud to Claire as they sat on the porch of their permanent home at Jake's ranch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and crimson. Claire, now 8 years old and thriving in her new life, listened with the serious attention she gave to all matters involving justice and standing up for others. Mama, Claire said when Margaret finished reading, are there still bad men like Pierce out there? Margaret considered the question carefully. Yes, sweetheart. There probably always will be. But there are also good people like Jake and the marshals who fight against them. And sometimes ordinary people like us can make a difference too. Claire nodded solemnly. When I grow up, I want to be like Deputy Marshal Walsh. I want to help people who can't help themselves. Margaret smiled and pulled her daughter closer. I think that's a wonderful ambition. As the stars began to appear in the vast sky above them, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them from the desperate poverty of the tenement building to this peaceful ranch where they built a new life. She'd learned that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, that standing up to injustice was possible even when it seemed hopeless, and that sometimes the most unlikely alliances could change everything. Jake emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee and settled into the chair beside them. He'd officially retired from federal service to run the ranch full-time, though Margaret suspected he still consulted on particularly difficult cases. "Any regrets?" he asked, following her gaze out across the hills where cattle grazed peacefully in the gathering dusk. Margaret thought about the question seriously. She could have remained silent, accepted her fate, tried to survive as a victim rather than fighting back as a survivor. It would have been safer, simpler, and infinitely less dangerous. "None," she said finally. "Not a single one." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound carried across the ranch like a promise that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. Margaret had learned to face both with equal courage, secure in the knowledge that she would never again be powerless in the face of those who preyed on the vulnerable. Her hair had grown back, longer and fuller than before, but she no longer defined herself by what had been taken from her. Instead, she measured her worth by what she had given back: justice, safety, and hope to others who had faced the same darkness she had overcome. The story that had begun with scissors cutting through golden hair in an auction house had ended with a woman who had reclaimed not just her freedom, but her power to change the world around her. And that, Margaret knew, was a victory worth any price she had paid to achieve it. 2 years after Pierce's death, Margaret Henderson stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., her testimony helping to shape new federal laws that would protect vulnerable women throughout the expanding territories. She wore a simple but elegant dress that spoke of prosperity earned through honest work, and her golden hair, now grown past her shoulders, was styled in a way that projected both femininity and authority. "Gentlemen," she addressed the assembled. "Congressmen, the trafficking networks we exposed were not isolated incidents. They represent a systematic exploitation of legal loopholes that criminals use to prey upon society's most vulnerable members." The committee chairman, a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, leaned forward with interest. "Mrs. Henderson, in your estimation, how many women might currently be trapped in similar situations across the Western Territories?" Margaret had spent months researching this exact question, corresponding with federal investigators and women's advocacy groups throughout the region. Conservative estimates suggest at least 300 women are currently held under fraudulent debt arrangements. The actual number could be twice that. The implications were staggering. What had begun as Margaret's personal fight for freedom had revealed a criminal enterprise that stretched across multiple states and territories, involving hundreds of victims and generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. Back at the ranch, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both peaceful and purposeful. Claire, now 10 years old, had grown into a confident, intelligent child who devoured books and helped Margaret with correspondence related to their ongoing legal advocacy work. The little girl who had once cowered in a tenement room now spoke 3 languages and could calculate cattle prices faster than most adults. "Mama, there's a letter from that woman in Denver," Claire announced one morning, holding up an envelope with careful hands, "the one who started the school for rescued women." Margaret opened the letter with anticipation. Martha Stevens had been one of the women they'd helped rescue from Pierce's network, and she'd used her freedom to establish an educational institute that taught formerly trafficked women practical skills like bookkeeping, correspondence, and business management. "She says 15 more women graduated this month," Margaret read aloud. "All of them have found employment with legitimate businesses or have started their own enterprises." The letter continued with updates on other women they'd helped over the past 2 years. Sarah Mitchell had become a federal investigator specializing in trafficking cases. Maria Santos had opened a successful bakery in Colorado Springs. Lisa Parker had married a good man and was expecting her first child. Each success story represented a victory against the system that had tried to destroy them all. More importantly, each woman who rebuilt her life served as proof that survival was possible, that the future could be different from the past. Jake entered the kitchen carrying a telegram that had arrived with the morning mail delivery. His expression was serious but not alarmed, the look of a man dealing with important business rather than immediate crisis. Federal marshals arrested the last of Pierce's associates yesterday, he announced. Marcus Dalton, the territorial judge, who'd been signing the fraudulent debt documents. That closes the final case in the investigation. Margaret felt a deep satisfaction at the news. Dalton's arrest had been particularly challenging because of his political connections and the legal protections afforded to sitting judges. But patient investigation had finally uncovered enough evidence to prove his corruption beyond reasonable doubt. What happens to his victims? Claire asked, always concerned about the people caught in the aftermath of these legal proceedings. All debt arrangements signed by Dalton are being reviewed by federal courts, Jake explained. Anyone held under fraudulent papers will be freed and their obligations legally voided. The scope of the victory was almost overwhelming. What had begun with Margaret's desperate situation in a city tenement had ultimately freed hundreds of women and dismantled a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years. But Margaret had learned that lasting change required more than just prosecuting criminals. It required building systems that prevented such exploitation from recurring. That's why she now spent much of her time working with federal legislators to draft new laws governing debt collection, labor contracts, and the treatment of vulnerable populations. There's something else, Jake continued, his expression shifting to something Margaret couldn't quite read. I received a letter from the territorial governor. He's offering me the position of federal marshal for the entire southwestern region. Margaret set down her coffee cup, understanding immediately what this meant. The position was a significant honor, recognition of Jake's role in exposing Pierce's network and his skills as an investigator. It would also mean leaving the ranch to travel extensively throughout the territory. That's wonderful, she said, meaning it despite the complications such a position would create for their family life. I haven't accepted yet, Jake said quietly. The work would take me away from home for weeks at a time. Claire's at an age where she needs stability, and your advocacy work is based here. Claire looked between her mother and the man who had become her father in everything but name. Would you be helping more people like Mama helped? Yes, Jake admitted. There are still criminal networks operating throughout the territory. Someone needs to coordinate a federal response. Then you should do it, Claire said with the matter-of-fact certainty that Margaret had learned to respect. Mama and I can take care of the ranch, and when you come home, you can tell us about all the bad people you caught. Margaret smiled at her daughter's simple wisdom. Claire had grown up understanding that sometimes doing the right thing required sacrifice, that protecting others was worth personal inconvenience. There's one more consideration, Jake said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Margaret, I've been thinking about this for months. I know our arrangement began under unusual circumstances, but... He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Margaret's breath caught as she realized what was happening. I love you both more than I ever thought possible. I'd like our family to be official, if you'll have me. The proposal was so perfectly Jake, practical, heartfelt, and offered without expectation or pressure. Margaret looked at the ring nestled in the box, then at Claire's excited face, then at Jake's patient expression. 2 years ago, she'd been a woman with no choices, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Now she was being offered a choice that would define the rest of her life, and she was free to make it based on love rather than desperation. Yes, she said simply. Yes to the marshal position, and yes to making our family official. The wedding took place 3 months later in the ranch's front yard, with federal judges, rescued women, ranch hands, and territorial officials all gathered to celebrate. Deputy Marshal Catherine Walsh served as Margaret's maid of honor, while Claire stood proudly as flower girl. scattering petals from the garden they'd planted together. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during the ceremony when Sarah Mitchell, now a federal investigator herself, read a letter from women across the territory who had been freed through their efforts. We are women who were told we had no value except what others assigned to us. We were taught that our debts defined our worth, that our mistakes made us property. Margaret Henderson showed us that none of that was true. She proved that we could fight back, that we could win, and that we could help others do the same. Today we celebrate not just a wedding, but the continuation of a family that has made all our families possible. As Margaret exchanged vows with Jake, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with scissors cutting through her hair, marking her as property to be sold. It ended with a choice freely made, surrounded by people who loved and respected her for who she had become rather than what had been done to her. 6 months after the wedding, Margaret received a letter that brought everything full circle. It came from a young woman named Emma Walsh, the daughter of Catherine Walsh, whose murder Pierce had used to terrorize his victims. Mrs. Morrison, the letter read, I wanted you to know that I'm graduating from law school next month, and I've accepted a position with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's new unit, investigating organized crime. My mother's death was not in vain if it helps prevent others from suffering the same fate. Thank you for making sure her story was told and her killers were brought to justice. Margaret shared the letter with Claire and Jake at dinner that evening, and they discussed what it meant that a new generation was taking up the fight against injustice. Claire, now 11 and already showing remarkable aptitude for mathematics and law, announced her intention to attend college and perhaps become a federal prosecutor. I want to help people like you helped people, Mama, she said. But I want to stop the bad men before they hurt anyone. Margaret smiled at her daughter's ambition, remembering her own dreams at that age and how life had taken her on paths she never could have imagined. That's a noble goal, sweetheart, and I have no doubt you'll achieve it. That night, as Margaret sat at her desk working on correspondence related to the new federal anti-trafficking legislation, she reflected on how much had changed. The frightened woman who had accepted auction as inevitable had become someone who shaped federal policy. The desperate mother who had seen no options beyond survival had raised a daughter who saw endless possibilities for changing the world. Outside her window, the ranch stretched away into darkness, peaceful and prosperous under Jake's management and her financial oversight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were still women trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped, still criminals who preyed on the vulnerable, still laws that needed changing and systems that required reform. But tonight Margaret felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had not only survived, but had transformed her survival into something larger than herself. She'd learned that the most powerful weapon against injustice wasn't violence or wealth or political connections. It was the simple refusal to accept that evil was inevitable. Her hair had grown back, but she would never again be the woman whose worth could be measured by someone else's assessment of her appearance or her debts. She had become something far more valuable, a woman who knew her own strength and used it to strengthen others. The story that had begun with scissors and ended with choices proved that transformation was always possible, that victims could become victors, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could change the course of history simply by refusing to give up. And that, Margaret knew as she turned off her lamp and prepared for bed, was a legacy worth everything she'd endured to create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.